Welcome back everyone, Michael here with Offshore Citizen. The last few days we had a video on the subject of where my wealthiest clients are moving. This was a question that some of our people had in the comments, and it spurred another question in the comment, which was, okay, great, these are people who've already built wealth. What about for people who are wanting to build? Where are the best places for those people to go? And today I'm going to discuss that. Now, of course, a person in theory can build wealth anywhere. And so, I think the more interesting thing is to say, all right, how do we identify what are the key hotbeds that are going to be most responsible for creating some kind of success? And probably some of the answers are going to disappoint you. That being said, hopefully they are useful. So I'm going to start off the conversation by asking you this question. What factors do you believe are most significant or most important in building wealth? In other words, and I'm talking about that from the perspective of a location, right? So we're not talking about the personal characteristics that somebody has. We're not talking about something like that, but rather, what if you were to choose a location, what factors in that location are most significant in someone building wealth, okay? And so would love to hear from you in the comments. Let me know, and let's kind of explore this. So, we can look at a pretty broad range of criteria, right? We can look at, okay, the population dynamics in the country. We can look at things like language. We can look at things like tax rates. We can look at things like regulation. We can look at things like social safety net. We can look at things like weather. We can look at things like geographic location, probably 10 other things, right? I'm going to imply or suggest to you that the most objective way to figure this out is to look at places where wealth is being built and then extrapolate backwards to say, okay, what is it about those places that's resulting in that wealth being built? And I think it's pretty apparent if you start thinking about this that there is no general answer, meaning that depending on the field you're in, there are field-specific advantages. Let's use a simple historic example. If you wanted to be a big shot in the movie industry, you pretty much had to go to Hollywood, right? That's just that's where movies were being made. If you were to go to rural Missouri, a very low chance that you're going to, have big success in the movie industry. Just isn't movie industry there. Now you might say, hey, well, maybe rural Missouri, or let's pick a better example, maybe Wyoming or Nevada or Florida or something like this. The tax rates are better, right? So, that should be good. Turns out that's a small thing. The amount of tax is small as an impact relative to an ecosystem that fosters that growth, right? Likewise, we could turn around and we could say, well, if you want to be a big shot in finance, where do you go? Well, you probably go to New York, right? If you're saying, hey, you want to be successful in doing tech startups, well, you would go to Silicon Valley. And obviously there's kind of global equivalents to this, right? You have places like Hong Kong, you have places like London, and so on and so forth around the world. But in those industries, there was this microcosm that helped to make you successful within that space. And that's a super interesting thing to think about, right? What are the elements that go into that success? Sometimes it's access to capital, sometimes it's access to talent, sometimes it's the social circle that you're exposed to, sometimes it's, job opportunities, et cetera, right? Interestingly, these are typically some pretty high tax places, right? So the bias for people watching this channel might be, hey, listen, you want to go to the lowest tax place with the least regulation, maybe the lowest cost of labor, and that's going to be your success point. The evidence does not really support that, right? We can generally see that there's not a lot of wealth being generated in Africa. Why not? Really interesting, right? There's not a lot of wealth being generated in Latin America proportionally. Why not? Something's going on there. There's not a lot of wealth being built in, Southern Europe relative to Northern or Western Europe. Why not, right? And of course, part of that is the starting point, right? You say, okay, well, when you're starting with very little, then you're going to be in a different situation than when you have a lot. But there's also just a lot of enabling structure around creating success. And as I thought about this topic, one of the things that came to mind is that depending on the level that you're at personally in your journey, there's a very different set of circumstances that might serve you. So let's use an example. if you're struggling to just get by, then the stress of that struggle probably hurts you more than most other factors are going to help you, all right? So let's use as a simple example. If you're saying, hey, listen, I'm worried that I won't be able to pay my bills, right? I'm worried I might lose my job, and if I lose my job, I'm not going to, be able to do anything. I'm going to be debt-ridden, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that's probably a negative that's pretty hard to counterbalance, right? Once you move to a point where you're like, okay, great, I have some savings, and I have some experience, and I have some connections, and I've got a little bit of momentum, that's very different than when you're at that starting point. And this probably explains to a large extent why, say, Africa has a hard time producing a lot of wealth, right? Is you simply have people who are, to a large extent, struggling with the basic necessities. And when you're struggling with basic necessities, it's hard to be innovative, it's hard to work on kind of furthering things. It's also interesting that if you look statistically, more unicorns tend to come out of, unicorns are like startups that gave a $1 billion valuation, per capita tend to come out of Denmark and Sweden than out of pretty much any other part of the world. And you can say, well, hang on a minute, aren't these socialist type countries? Aren't they high tax? Aren't they high regulation? Aren't they, the wages are high, et cetera? Yeah, all that is true. So what is it about that ecosystem that works? And I'm going to suggest to you that part of it is that people are in a position where they can take risks and fail because they have a social safety net that is protecting them. That doesn't mean that it fosters very well as you grow. Most of those companies are typically going to start moving out of those countries as they grow past a certain point. And you've seen examples of this with companies like Spotify that end up deciding to, as they build further offices, locate them outside of that region because the landlord-tenant laws aren't good, the employment rules don't favor that company, etc. But when you're getting started, having that basic taken care of is really important. And there's different ways that can happen. That can happen through the state, that can happen through family, that can happen at a level where you've already got some establishment. But it would be disingenuous not to recognize that. Likewise, something like taxes don't matter too much when you're not making money, right? So whereas if you're making $1 million or $2 million a year, the effect on compounding of having 50% of that go to taxes can be pretty substantial, right? Whereas if you're saying, hey, listen, you're only making, I don't know, let's use Canada as an example. Your corporate tax rate on the small business level, which is below 500,000 Canadian dollars per year, is, depending on the province, like 12%. So, this isn't so bad, right? It's really, once you go above that 500,000 Canadian dollars level, that it starts to become an issue. And a lot of places have graduated tax rates, right? Many, many examples like this where the tax burden is not so bad on the lower end. And so what does it matter what the top tax bracket is, which is the one we tend to focus on, right? So in that sense, I think it's worth considering. The next thing that I think is worth considering is, are you in a culture which fosters making things happen versus are you in a culture that fosters kind of relaxation and leisure? And in this sense, I think generally speaking, I just spent a week in Italy and it was great. You go to the Italian cafe, but I was mentioning to my wife, if I was living in Italy, I would definitely take a siesta in the afternoon. It's July, it's hot in Italy. What are you going to do, right? It's just hard to be productive. I remember spending a few months in Bali a couple of years ago, and we were just talking about it was hard to get work done because the heat and humidity are quite oppressive, right? If you're in that situation, it's going to be tougher for you. So whereas there's things that you may favor from a lifestyle standpoint that seem really great that may not really support you that much from a functionality building standpoint. I have some good clients, friends who built really successful businesses who went to places like Albania to build. And basically they're like, hey, I spent the whole time pretty much in my apartment. I would go to the grocery store and the gym, and that was it. These 3 places, just work, work, work. It was very easy to do that in this environment because there wasn't a lot of distractions, the cost of living was low. In that particular case, there were people around who spoke some more language to them. There was some advantages like that. At the same time, if you were going to have a lot of friction in getting basic things done, so for example, I'll spend a lot of time at a computer typing and it will end up hurting my back over time. Well, if I can't take care of my basic health, then quickly the amount of energy that I can dedicate to being productive and effective decreases quite a bit, right? So what I would propose to you is that when you're getting started, you want to start at some place where your base level is taken care of, which is why it's not a terrible idea to start in a place like London, a place like the US, whether it's New York or whether it's San Francisco or something like that. It's not a bad idea to start in a place like Netherlands, right? These places, when you're kind of a solo operator and you can gain access to some of these services and infrastructure, and maybe you're somebody you're from there, so as a result you have this social safety net and you can have a part-time job, that's very different, right? If you're in a situation where it's like, imagine, let's contrast these two situations. You're in Germany, right? And you can have a part-time job and then you're building a side hustle, versus you're in Bulgaria and you can have a side hustle. Well, the reality is that your wages in Bulgaria are probably like 700 euros a month or something like that, versus maybe like 3,000 euros a month. And your costs aren't proportionally higher. And as a result, you're in a situation where you're actually better off being in, say, Germany, which is why lots of people leave Bulgaria to go to Germany, and you have more resources to dedicate to this side hustle, okay? Which is important, right? You need capital in order to do that. Likewise, your circle of friends, people who can maybe contribute, the kind of friends and family who may throw in money, is better when you're in an environment where people have some extra money versus in places where people don't have some extra money. So that's also important. So giving that a general idea, I'm going to say, if you're getting started, I would say some of these kind of what we call first world countries are probably actually better places to start in many regards. As you hit a certain level where you say, okay, I've had some success, I'm doing, I've got a 6-figure a year business. Then at that point in time, I think depending on your business, if your business is online, that's quite different than if your business is in person, right? But if you're in a situation, let's assume that you have location independence. It doesn't matter where you are, because a lot of businesses still do, right? Assuming that they aren't, then I would say places that make sense to go at that stage are places where, number one, have a high degree of expats, entrepreneurs, people who are doing things, builders, let's call them that, they're builders, who you can be around. Number two, it's relatively easy to do business and to live, right? Living is, the convenience of living should not be underestimated. And number three, it is going to be relatively good infrastructure, relatively low tax. Basically, you're able to throw what it is that you have into there. And probably also not a place that is very distracting in terms of lifestyle. So this, I think, is maybe one of the good reasons why a lot of, in spite of the, on paper, some favorable rules, you don't see a lot of great success stories coming out of places like Malta, right? In that sense, what would those places be, okay? All right, so I would suggest to you that some of those places could be some of the Eastern European countries, maybe. If you've relocated, I've seen quite a few people who have their success stories and they kind of relocate there, but I think that you only grow up to a certain point. So I think it's a good place to go from, hey, I've got some momentum, but it's not that strong, to, hey, listen, it's kind of like a good place to go from 6 to 7 figures. Let's call it that, okay? So for example, places like Bulgaria, places like Ukraine maybe a little bit less because there's some advantages to the financial infrastructure within the EU, but some countries like that, whether it's Hungary, etc. These countries, though, tend to top out, I find. They don't tend to support you very well in going from 7 figures to 8 figures, right? That range there, maybe you're going to look at places more like Dubai. You may look in the US at places more like Puerto Rico. There's a great social circle of entrepreneurs there. Maybe you're going to look at places like Portugal. That could be an interesting way to go. Maybe you're going to look at places like, if you can get in there, Singapore. If you're doing something that's going to require raising capital, you're talking about the US, you're talking about London, you're talking about maybe some of the other places. I mean, depending on which market you're appealing to. You could be in a situation where Singapore's venture capital scene might be useful for you. You might find that China's is useful to you. Again, that's going to be a tougher one to access depending on your familiarity with the region and language and the different players, etc. But could be useful. Those are places that I would typically look. All right, and yeah, I would tend to go to those places. Would I go to places like Georgia? I think Georgia's a little far out. I don't see people hanging out in Georgia and very successfully building businesses. I see them kind of like staying at a certain level. It's like, okay, you can go there and you can live inexpensively and you can keep more of your money and you can kind of hang out, but I don't see people building there. I see quite a bit building out of Malaysia, although that might be a function of the population size and less to do with the percentage of the overall population that's having some degree of success. Again, I think a lot of people have gone to Portugal, and so I think that entrepreneurial community is going to foster a lot more growth out of Portugal than has happened historically. Historically, Portugal wasn't so great. Similar deal with Puerto Rico, right? Because people have gone to Puerto Rico, there's an ecosystem that now creates success that wasn't there in the past. London, obviously, is a place that if you're wanting to do that jump from 7 to 8, I would say like UK in general has been a pretty good place, even though it's got a lot of painfulness to it. Let's talk about some other industries, right? If you're talking about something like real estate, well, you want an environment that supports the right deals. So I talked to a client a while ago who was mentioning, he was in Germany for a bunch of time and, it was really difficult to make it work. Went to Australia and he was like, hey, it's easy to make money in Australia. I'm a big critic of the ATO and their rules and all these kinds of things. But the truth is, if you're in the real estate game, Australia has been in a boom, right? That's just the way that it goes. There's easy access to financing. People understand how to do construction and get things done and flip and all of this stuff that goes into being able to carry out successful deal making. Similar for certain parts of the US, right? If you want to go and do various different real estate deals, buying, flipping, etc., there's a big infrastructure for that. Can you do the same thing in Italy? Not so much. The capital appreciation, even though you can go and buy properties quite cheap, the capital appreciation isn't there in order to be able to do this. The ability to quickly go in and do renovations and flip, etc., not there, same thing. Lots of examples like that. So yeah, I would say Netherlands is an interesting place to start. In fact, like in general, these countries that have a good safety net, I think are good places to start. Now within those places, I would say that there are certain ecosystems. For example, if I was in Canada, I would focus more on Toronto than I would on any other city. And the reason for this is I noticed that there's more of an entrepreneurial culture, more of a culture of getting things done, whereas there's more of that leisure culture that you get in places like Vancouver. I love Vancouver, I think it's a great city, but it's less about hustle, it's less about making things happen, it's more about lifestyle. And when you want to build something, you don't want that distraction, okay? So that would be an idea. Likewise, if we were to go and look at the US in general, I would say that East Coast tends to be more of that than West Coast. I do see quite a bit of success that comes out of kind of the Austin, Texas area. So I think that's, again, a great place to maybe go in and build things from like if you're American, and you've kind of had some success, et cetera, you can go and plug into a great community there and have a bunch of success. It's probably where I would go if I was living in the US or something, would be somewhere like that. Maybe I would go and check out someplace like Puerto Rico just because the tax environment is so good, but I think it makes sense only after you reach a certain financial level. Places like Florida, I think the climate just works against you, which is interestingly, it's kind of ironic because you would suggest that the same would be true in Texas, but I think you just built this community that's more, again, more like getting things done in there. I think that, again, UAE right now increasingly, in particular Dubai, has increasingly a community which is really strong in that regard. And yeah, then I would look at, if you're able to do it online, then it's useful to go to somewhere in Eastern Europe where you can get low taxes, low costs, kind of less distractions, and just like grind. It's not so good from the ecosystem standpoint, but you can get good infrastructure. So your internet infrastructure is fantastic. Your infrastructure for hiring people is fantastic. So if you need that proximity as power, get some people in. It's good for that initial level until you start to tap out the talent base. When you start to tap out the talent base, then you need to go somewhere where you have a broader talent pool. And that tends to be, maybe you can do some stuff in Asia if you're able to make that cultural shift work for you, especially if you're somebody from that region, and I see lots of success coming out of there. Or alternatively, maybe you end up having to go to some other country that has a larger population that you can tap into and build accordingly. The last thing I'm going to mention is there is something to be said for going into environments where they've exhausted ideas, okay? This was a conversation I was having the other night when I was having dinner with somebody in Italy, and native Italian, somebody who's building business there, etc. And was just discussing, hey, listen, like there's a shortage of ideas here. So if you're the person who brings ideas, that brings opportunity. And I thought that was interesting. I don't have personal experience with that. Most of the Italians that I know have left Italy, but I do know a few people who have come in and really done phenomenally well in the Italian market, in part by being able to be innovative and fast moving and on top of it, and tapping into a pretty niche market which would normally not be tapped into. This being said, in most cases they do that by first leaving and then kind of passporting back in. And I've seen the same thing in the French market. People who leave the French market and then sell back into the French market because there's less competition. I've seen something similar with people who are not in the Spanish market, but they leave the Spanish market. In this case, it's not just Spain, we're talking about Latin America, but they're able to capitalize on this large market using that external launch pad. So I hope that gives some ideas, makes things make sense for you. Clearly, beyond that, I've done the previous video where I was talking about, when you start getting to past a certain point, I think it's just fairly obvious that the value proposition of the savings by being able to, have an environment that's supportive of wealth is quite different. So anyway, I hope that helps. And if you have any questions, put them in the comments below. If you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button. Really appreciate your support. Check out the other videos. And if you want help with any of these topics that we talk about here, please book a call with me, calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer. There's a link in the description below. Or send me a message through our websites, offshorecitizen.net and offshorecapitalist.com. All right. I will see you guys on the next video.